Good afternoon, welcome back to the final sessions of the conference today. My name is John Moylan. Until about a year ago, I was industry correspondent with the BBC, and I got to know your industry because I spent a lot of time covering energy and the trials and tribulations of what was going on around energy policy. And it's a great pleasure to be back here again. I was here last year. I'll be your host for the final few sessions. Now, coming up in about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, we are going to be talking to Chris Stark, who is the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change, which, as you know, is the body that advises government, the statutory body advises government on how we meet our climate change targets. As an organisation, it's pushed out an awful lot of reports. Recently, it's got a lot more punchy in the kind of things that it's saying need to happen if we're going to keep on track. Recently had a report out on hydrogen and land use and farming and implications for perhaps what we eat. So I just want you to get your thinking heads on and think about what you might want to ask him. He'll be with us in a few minutes' time. And I think that's going to be a really great session. But first of all, I demand your attention for our next speaker. As a journalist, there's probably few issues that I covered which had more traction with the audience and which the audience cared about than energy prices. And I covered it that whole period from 2013 when Ed Miliband came out and talked about a price freeze, and we saw the row and how that escalated politically. And we ended up with where we are today with direct intervention into the market and with a price cap. For the next 15 minutes, we just want to think about, are we getting it wrong when we think about energy? And when we think about the price of energy, has the industry been getting it wrong in how it talks to consumers about all of that? Is there another way that the industry should be trying to engage consumers in terms of how they deal with their energy needs? So I'd like to welcome, to discuss all this, the Director of the Association for Decentralised Energy, Tim Rotheray.
Thank you very much, John. Afternoon, everyone. The other evening, I was at home and we were having a dinner party. And I went in to the kitchen area and we had over the table laid, candles out, and had a napkin on the table. And my partner turned to me and she said, "Oh, could you put some music on?" And I had a bit of a think about what we might listen to, and nothing came to mind. I couldn't think of something to listen to. So I picked up my phone, and I tapped on the Spotify app, and it gave me a bunch of genres of music. And I tapped on jazz, and I hit play, and all of a sudden, music came out of the speakers. I put my phone down, and I went back to focusing on making the dinner and having an evening with my friends. That way of interacting with technology is similar, I think, to how customers want to interact with energy. I was using Spotify and my phone to make life easier so that I could focus on doing something that I wanted to be getting on with, something more important. And you, in the audience, or us, you're kind of like the energy, you're like the vinyl aficionado of the energy world, yeah? So you're kind of choosing the perfect vinyl record, putting it through the best amplifier, the right speakers, just to get that perfect sound. But that isn't the way most people deal with energy. And this gives us a bit of a problem, because customers want energy to be easier, but their energy system needs customers to be more engaged and more active than ever before. So there are two key reasons for this. The first one is climate change. Not only do we need customers to start thinking about whether they can afford the energy that they are buying and whether it's available, but we also need them to think about whether it is low carbon. We need them to be making the right choices on the appliances that they're buying, whether or not they should insulate more or choose a lower carbon technology. So we need customers to make informed choices, which are not easy choices. At the same time, the energy system needs customers to behave differently in terms of how they operate. And this isn't just householders, this is businesses, industry, the public sector. And this is actually because of decarbonisation. This graph shows a remarkable transition of which I'm sure you're all aware. We have seen a growth in low-carbon electricity generation and a fall in fossil generation, with 2017 being a landmark year, where the amount of generation from low carbon started to exceed the amount from fossil generation. But that growth in renewables has led to two things happening. The first thing is that the fossil generation that could follow demand, that could ramp up and down in response to customer demand, is falling. But customer demand continues to travel up and down, and we've got to change it. But the second thing is that the growth, particularly of renewables, means that the type of response we need is different. We do not need responses which happen on relatively longer timescales. We need very fast responses, and traditional centralized equipment really struggles with that. Not only is that a problem in terms of the system overall, it is compressed in time. So, if we look, this is a typical demand curve of a typical day, okay? So, you will probably all be familiar with this, with what happens in the power system. There's a peak in demand in the morning, it then falls in the afternoon, and then goes to the peak in the evening. And of course, this varies across the season. To accommodate greater low-carbon generation and to ensure that it's cost-effective, we need energy customers to be shifting their demand away from those peaks into those troughs in the course of a day. But within that day, within that time period, we have shorter time periods where we also need response. The white line here is the balanced point where the electricity system is in perfect balance, and this is real data from what happened in the energy system. National Grid is fighting a constant battle to bring that blue line towards that white line, and it needs response that we're losing in the central generation system. But within that time period, there is even further flexibility to maintain the stability of the grid through its frequency. So we are saying that we need energy customers to respond in day, in hour, and within the minute. Now, I don't know about you, but I do not believe that energy customers are going to do this, be it industrial, commercial, or domestic. They simply want to get on with their lives. So we have this situation of a growing chasm. On one side, we have customers who have more and more complex lives that want energy to be easier, and on the other side, we have the energy system, which is wanting customers to be more and more complex. My suggestion it is for us as the industry to bridge that gap. And the way that I think that we bridge that gap is through energy as a service. What do I mean by energy as a service? Energy as a service ultimately is about the energy provider aligning themselves on the same side as the customer and working with them to meet their energy needs rather than trying to sell them more units of energy. It might be by providing them with warmth, number of warm hours per year or per day. It might be providing them with miles of transport in a vehicle. And you might think, okay, well, this is a supplier discussion, and I'm not a supplier. But if you think about it, that might also apply to an equipment manufacturer, because this equipment is being installed and then has to be operated in a particular way. Or it might be provided by a software developer. So the idea of energy as a service is something that can apply to all customers, to all market participants. Yeah, well, the next obvious thing is, I don't know about you, I've been in the energy industry for about 10 years, and I have heard people talking about energy as a service since I joined. So why now? Why is it going to be different? Why is this going to work? And I can see three kind of key reasons why there are objections. The first one is culture. The culture of the customer. Is the customer really prepared for me to go into their office or into their home and start managing their equipment? Well, the idea of people not owning equipment which they call theirs, effectively service provision, is growing. Peugeot advertise, just add fuel. You go to your Peugeot dealership, you choose a car, you specify it, and you pay a monthly fee. When you introduce someone to it, you say, yeah, this is my car. It's not your car. Actually, the only thing that you pay for is the monthly fee and the fuel. They insure it, they maintain it, and they own it. Mud Jeans is a circular economy design company that rents out clothing. And you pay for your jeans on a monthly basis and change them every 12 months. And Spotify doesn't actually let me own the music that I'm listening to. So people are already used to service provision. Okay, so then the obvious other question for customers is, what about data? We've heard it earlier today. Well, most of you will have come here today, I imagine, using Google Maps or Citymapper, and you type in your destination and it provides you an indication of how to get here. In that situation, you are sharing your data with Google, location data, in return for information as to how to get here. Customers are prepared to share data with third parties in return for a service that they deem to be valuable. So, if customers are prepared to do it, the next question is, will it stack up? Do the economics stack up? And I think this is probably one of the key barriers that we've had. Energy, and in particular heat, and it is the decarbonisation of heat that is really at the nub of this problem. Most heat is provided by gas in the UK. Gas is relatively cheap. Okay, it's relatively low value. If, therefore, I can provide a customer with savings on their gas bill, if the total gas bill is a relatively small amount, then the amount of savings that I can provide is a small proportion of that, and therefore it is difficult to make the economics stack up. But if you have seen recent work from the Committee on Climate Change on decarbonising energy, we are moving towards electrification and the use of hydrogen. Electricity in the UK costs roughly 4 times what gas does per unit. So optimizing electricity demand makes sense just because it's more expensive. And hydrogen is going to be demanded for peaking power generation, for peak heat demand, industrial heat, heavy transport, and potentially shipping. So the demand for hydrogen, even if hydrogen prices fall, is going to remain high, and that will keep hydrogen prices relatively high. So we are going to deal with the 2 main energy vectors in the system having high value. But that's not all. The discussion that we've had about flexibility applies in particular in this idea of whether it's going to stack up. This is what my energy supplier is currently offering me in my home. I currently pay 14.5 pence per kilowatt hour. But they are suggesting that I switch to a tariff which has 3 different tariffs, and the one that matters in this is the peak one, between 4 and 7 p.m. My electricity supplier is asking me to pay £400 a megawatt hour. That's roughly 10 times the price of wholesale market electricity. And this, of course, is in a home which has a fairly low electric demand. But of course, if this home had an electric vehicle or an electric heat pump, the ability to shift away from that peak is going to be hugely valuable. But as a customer, I do not want to be bothered with having to figure out whether or not I should be switching something on or off. So the opportunity to provide flexibility means that the economics of energy as a service is more likely to stack up in the future. So, if the customers are ready to accept it, if the economics are going to increasingly stack up, the third challenge for me is perhaps the biggest of all, and that is the culture of our industry itself. Are we as an industry prepared to consider a different way of doing business? I can imagine the exchange. Someone says, you know what, we have a model, we go in, the meter's there, we bill the customer, they pay their bill, it's fine. I don't want to have to get in to understand how they use different appliances within their home or school or office. It is too complex for me. But consider for 1 minute where that has got us. The energy system is vilified by the press and by politicians. There is a complete absence of trust in the energy sector. And it's not just suppliers, although it started with them. It's a plague on all your houses. It's the entire energy system that is regarded as being not fit for purpose. The result of that in policy is that we have policy making which works directly counter to the market interests of participants. So with energy suppliers, we come up with the energy company obligation, where we oblige suppliers to reduce demand for the commodity that they make a profit from selling. We effectively cut the legs out from the business model that they have. And in energy efficiency, and in building performance, and in efficiency of equipment, we end up trying to regulate the performance of equipment because it's not necessarily in the interest of the installer at the time to install the most efficient bit of kit. Energy as a service, on the other hand, offers a tantalizing prospect of rather being in a conflicted relationship with the customer, of coming and standing alongside the customer and determining how best we meet their needs and that they get what they want and we are able to work with them rather than against them. The energy system then has a policy opportunity because rather than policy being in conflict and seeking to undermine the business of energy provision, it can actually help inform the way in which we come up with energy policy because we have the same goal, which is meeting the customer's need in the most effective way. Not only that, but the technology choice then starts to rest with experts, people like you who actually understand what the appropriate solution is, rather than leaving a complex decision to people who don't have the time to make that decision. So for me, the possibility of providing energy as a service opens up the possibility that we could create a restored relationship with the customer and that we could actually become a trusted sector. And that is not all, because this problem of customers wanting energy to be easier and their lives to be made simpler, and the energy system, on the other hand, needing those customers to be more engaged and more active, is one that applies globally. There may be different markets, different climates, and different energy needs, but that fundamental challenge remains. So if we together can crack the complexity of making energy as a service work, we're not talking just about the UK market, we're talking about a global opportunity. And if we can deliver that, then perhaps maybe we can together talk about delivering the end of the kilowatt hour. Where do you want me? Do you want me to?
Is he right? What do we think about this? Is this a way to restore trust in the energy industry? Because I think you've got a long way to. I think you've got a long way to go. Are people ready for it? Because of the way that we've all switched to things like Spotify, or we're ready for it. We're ready for a service, rather than stacking up CDs or whatever on the shelf. What do we think? Questions? Come on.
Hi, Casey from Guru. Why would see a service, it would seem that in order to make the business model work, in order to make the business model work, you've got to rely even more on better data. And that information is going to come from meters. And those meters are going to be measuring, among other things, kilowatt hours. So kilowatt hours in this model don't die. They move behind the curtain, but they're essential as an enabler of the model in the first place.
Yes, they
Would
are.
you agree?
Yes.
No, it's a question.
No, there you go. Yeah, it's like Parliament, isn't it? Wouldn't you agree with me that? Yes. The kilowatt hour doesn't die. It does. Effectively, what happens is you end up with a business-to-business offering. The complexity of the energy system and the complexity of the decision-making, and indeed the data provision, which is a difficult question, ends up being a business energy service provider to somewhere else in the energy system, whether it be the national grid, whether it be the heat network operator, whoever it might be. But the point really is that the customer no longer receives a kilowatt hour bill, and the work that we do in things like whether or not, classic one, whether or not bills are fair on a heat network. Customers say, I can buy gas for 4 pence a kilowatt hour, and my heat bill on my it says it's 8 pence a kilowatt hour. So this is twice as expensive. Yeah, it is, but unfortunately you haven't included the cost of your boiler, the cost of conversion, and the fact that so that, if we can move away from the idea of the customer buying kilowatt hours and we can move into something where the customer buys what it is that they need, then effectively the industry ends up getting back control, and we end up taking the initiative, so that we end up we can actually do all of that complexity, but the customer gets what they want, and then the whole policy discussion becomes a very different discussion. Whereas at the minute, the whole discussion around policy about switching and things like that actually doesn't really help us very much.
Question there.
Gareth Jones Fairheat. Spotify is a lovely example, and I use Spotify. And when I started using Spotify, one thing I noticed is that I listened to a lot more music. And I started listening to more and more music.
We know where this question's going, right?
And so when we start providing this service, we've got lovely heat. Oh, it's great. And we have these long showers, and we don't worry about those kilowatt hours. I'm serious. I mean, we see this, and we've seen it where we've installed, we've moved people to metering, and then we've moved them on to pay-as-you-go with actually see it, and we saw significant reductions in energy use. We've got a big issue on energy use, and going forward, great, we get a lovely relationship with our customers. Do we then have a huge increase in energy use?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there's two bits to that. The first one is that if the customer uses a lot of energy, it becomes your problem, whereas at the minute, it's your profit. So if the customer uses way more energy than we had agreed, I, as the provider of that service, have an economic problem. So it's in my interest to work with the customer to reduce their demand and to find ways to do that. The other thing is also that, think about your phone. You have an agreement. But if you go massively over that, or you can choose your contract and effectively how much flexibility you have. Like we were talking in the office, I've got an all-you-can-eat contract, and I'll just use it as much as other people will restrain themselves. And then if they go over, they'll pay more. But the other thing is that people talk about things like comfort taking in the energy efficiency world. Oh, we've insulated these homes, and people have warmed their homes up, and so the energy savings weren't. That's a good thing. The people that were living in it weren't warm enough in their homes, ended up heating them properly. So I think that it probably comes a lot back to the data point, which is customers will use more energy, but up to a point. I'm not going to go just continue to overheat my house to the point where I'm actually uncomfortable.
I think there was a question in the middle, just at the bottom here.
Hi, my name is Astrid Matze, City of Rotterdam. I think it can only work if there's trust in the data being used, and we already have the smart metering elements, and you see quite a lot of people don't want it because they don't trust the energy company to use it well, and they don't trust that the data is being used in their own benefit, but for the company's benefit. So how do you think you can tackle this quite important issue of having a relationship that has enough trust that people will join in?
So I had a really good conversation with someone recently, because as I've been thinking about this, the big challenge that I was thinking about was customers need to be able to switch provider in the event that they're not happy with the relationship for whatever reason. In that world, if they switch out, but I've bought them a heat pump for 15 years, which I own as an asset, or if I've insulated their home, or if I have put solar panels on the roof of their school or whatever, and I've got some long-term value, how do I deal with that? And the chap I was talking to is a chap called Mark Coyle from, I think it's Utilisoft. And actually, what's happened in the smart meter market in the UK, the way in which they've been paid for, is that effectively the asset ownership and the service provision end up being split. So the person that owns the asset and the person that provides the service are two separate entities. And in that world, the asset owner has a really significant interest in the long-term performance of whatever asset that might be it the quality of the insulation, the quality of the heat generation, the quality and the use of the PV, or whatever it might be. In that world, it is the finance entity that effectively owns the asset that holds the service provider to account, and things like the quality of the original install and its performance, because it's in their interest to make sure that they get their money back. But the other part, in terms of the service provision, the trust element, then if you don't own the asset, that allows the customer to make choices. When the trust does break down, and of course there will be elements when that happens, the customer is able to switch to a different provider. So you don't end up tying the customer in for really long-term contracts, which I think you have to get around, because that's one way of managing the trust issue.
We're running over time. I think we have to leave it there. The death of the kilowatt hour, you heard it here first. Can we thank Tim?